So guys, this is it, the Contemptor Dreadnought. It's the fig I decided to paint for the Horus Heresy Dark Age box. As you can see, I decided to go for a few sub-assemblies. What you see in front of you is all blue tacked together so I can have access to all the pieces I paint along. I did as I said in the unboxing video, in that I took the model I liked the least and tried to make it look as cool as I could. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things I don't have at my disposal right now. I'm still missing the decals that have yet to come out. They're on pre-order this weekend. Now, what you see here is this frame made all of this, meaning that the main body of the Contemptor Dreadnought, which is very cool, all fits in one frame, so that the second frame is all of the options, weapons options, the power claw, the hands, the shoulders, all of these details. So what I feel this gives us the option is that Games Workshop can then put out other weapons frame to give us different variations on the Contemptor Dreadnought. Now, if you want something that's going to give me positive points for the Contemptor, that's it. Also, you'll notice I'm pointing some places where it seems to be easy to put magnets. In fact, I can confirm, having done it already and just doing this voiceover, that the magnets are fairly easy to install on a Dreadnought if you have the proper pieces and the proper size magnets to install. Meaning that you can have fully customizable Contemptor Dreadnought, being able to switch out the weapons. The only weapon I wasn't able to make it so that you can switch it out is the cannon inside of the power claw. As you can see, I've already airbrushed all the pieces. The reason for that is that I don't have a very good camera setup for airbrushing, but this is, if ever I want to do an airbrushing tutorial or a run through speed painting of my airbrush process, I'll have to do that independently. This is just to show you very quickly how I put together everything. These are all the sub-assemblies. Some of them are off frames, but they're mostly the two arms and the weapons. Now, one of the things I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do before I do any highlight, is going to be to weather things. I'm going to be using the sponge to hit all those edges that I pointed out earlier. So I rip out a piece of sponge, and I've mixed some, I believe I took some some Rhinox hide Citadel paint, which I put on a surface. I put on a palette, and then I dilute just a little bit to give it like that milky texture that we use. And using the sponge, I just very lightly hit the edges so that where logically paint would chip, I get these darker portions. I forgot to take off this piece. So there, I hit all of the edges so I can get this darkened pieces. I'm speeding through this. I'm not going to show you the entire process. The unedited video for this, for all of the painting, was over 5 hours long, and that's not including all the airbrushing that I did and some of the detailing that you'll see in the end product that's not specified, that we don't go through here. So the important thing is to hit the edges. You don't want to hit most of the flat surfaces. Those wouldn't necessarily get chipped quite as much as edges. The reason being that, as you'll notice on vehicles or even on furniture if you at home, is that whatever gets hit the hardest usually are the edges, the corners on the piece. Now already I'm kind of liking the Contemptor Dreadnought a little bit more. This is a very posable model. I give him a fairly static pose just because this is the first one I'm going to be doing. I don't know if I'll be doing more for this army, but you could put him in a running position. He's got a lot of flexibility in the joints. I didn't take advantage of it as much as I should have or could have, but he's still got kind of a menacing position, which is fine. I mean, I like the idea of Dreadnoughts not necessarily being these super agile ninja robot-esque things. I like them to be kind of lumbering, so I went with that look. But if you want them to have a more dramatic pause, that's easily achievable with minimum conversion, if any conversion at all. The colors I used for the green and for the white are a little bit more muted than what I would usually use. That's because I knew from the get-go that I would be using some glazes at the end. Now, one of the things that's important when I'm doing this kind of chipping is the highlighting process. Now, highlighting process, as you see, like, it's mostly hit the normal edges, obviously to make everything come out. But as you'll see later on, it's also to go pick out the actual underneath of every chipped piece of paint. This gives the painting, the chipped painting, a sort of three-dimensional feeling so that the paint seems to have some thickness to it. I wasn't sure when I first picked Rhinox Hide for the colors on the for the chipping, whether it was going to be too dark or too light. If it was going to be too dark, it would just look like black, and I wouldn't be very happy with it. If it's too light, then it doesn't really pop quite as much. But this gave me exactly the results I wanted. You can see here that I'm trying to get as many of the edges as possible, but when it comes to the chipped area, this is where I try to go around the chipping and not hit the actual edge, as the actual edge would be chipped paint and thus have like that rusted brown underneath. I probably could have gone further with the rusting, maybe give it some depth of its own edge highlighting, maybe a little orange there to make the rust seem even more fresh. But I'm trying to go for, I'm really embracing the grim dark of the 30K setting with these models. And this is also, in a way, this is my test model. This is the first one I'm trying this color scheme on, and I'm going to be trying to use this color scheme then later on everything. You can see the difference already from the two shoulder pads, the one with the edge highlighting and the one without. Now, the edge highlighting looks a little stark already, but once I apply the last stage, the most dramatic one, as you'll see, it kind of blends in a lot more, especially with the glaze I put to make the green pop out a little bit more. It blends in all of these edge highlighting, so I need them to be as stark as possible, otherwise they'll get lost with these last weathering stages. Now, I was saying that this is more than a 5-hour process to paint the entire fig, probably around 6 to maybe even up to 8. But when you think about how large and complex a Contemptor can be, I think it's a reasonable amount of time if you want to get good tabletop quality. Also, with all the amount of chipping I have, this adds a lot of time to the edge highlighting. If I were painting, say, I don't know, ultramarines, or perhaps even some iron imperial fists, I would probably go for much cleaner highlights. I wouldn't have as much battle damage, just because Loyalist feels like they should be a little cleaner. So I would save a lot of time right there. One of the things that you'll notice also is that I am not putting a lot of effort into dark lining the recesses on the Dreadnought. Reason being is that I have a stage towards the end that will take care of all of that, which is a weathering stage that really works perfectly for armies such as the Death Guard or any of these high weathering, super damaged armies. I don't know if I would use them. I mean, you can use them for Loyalists, obviously, but I feel that this is the kind of damage and weathering that works particularly well with an army like the Death Guard, whose thematic is death and decay. Now, if instead of the Ogre and Camo for all the pale pieces, for that milky beige, I'm using Screaming Skull. But it's essentially the same process. I'm trying to hit the edges, and I'm trying to get these all this edge highlighting, all this weathering to pop out. The one thing I do regret in working on this fig is making the helmet green, because as you'll see in the final product, the piece that goes around the head is also green, meaning that the head doesn't really stand out quite as much as it should, and that's absolutely just a color choice error on my part. I'm usually a lot more careful when I pick my colors. I regret making that mistake. It's a mistake I could have maybe gone back and fixed, but in the end product is still good enough, especially with the weathering. It looks fine. But if I were to do another Dreadnought, and I mean, there is the Leviathan Dreadnought that was announced on Warhammer Community, I'm probably going to be picking one up just because it's got this big lumbering feel that's great for Death Guard, and I want to, as always, I should maybe try to learn the game to get better at it, but I'm just trying to embrace the theme as much as possible. So expect me to paint a bunch of flamers in the future. Even though this is 3 times the speed, it still looks like it takes forever, but there's something fairly relaxing about doing this kind of hedge highlighting because it's so easy to know where you're putting your brush. It's so forgiving as you're doing sort of the highlighting itself that you might have noticed a couple of times that whenever I hit wrong, I just wipe it off with my finger. It just takes most, if not all, of the paint that's in the wrong place off. So it's very relaxing, very meditative as far as painting goes. I really enjoy it. You can already see just with those 2 stages of highlighting on the legs how much this piece is coming alive. And keeping in mind, this is tabletop quality work, at least as far as I'm concerned. Like I don't think this would be a worth Golden Demon competition. There's a lot that if you were to like zoom in and really look at the fig in person, you'll notice that the painting, like the brush strokes themselves, are not necessarily as clean as they should be. But on a tabletop for a game, I think this is going to look fantastic. So I'm very happy with it. This entire army is going to be practice just so I can do a good job on the Mortarion fig I have. Such an intimidating model that I don't want to get it wrong. So having 50 plus models to practice probably will be a good idea. There you go. Those are the legs. I think they pop off relatively well. This is the front piece I'm talking about. Now, one of the things that you'll notice very quickly is that that piece, the top is green where it's supposed to be beige, which is something I correct through some washes, and it kind of vanishes with the weathering. But again, a mistake in the planning stages of my coloring. This is the kind of mistakes that you want to pick out early. Another error I made while building the model, mostly because I didn't really know what I was doing. I kind of enjoy plasma when I do models, mostly because plasma allows me to do some pretty nice object source lighting. But reading more about the Death Guard, especially in 30K, I realized that they're not fond of plasma, so I had to rip out the glued gun, the model on the model, and replace it with a flamer, which is far more appropriate for the Death Guard. It's a stupid, very, very small detail. Most opponents would forgive if that wasn't what you see is what you get. But since painting is usually my priority when making an army, I try not to fudge too much on that. Also, I have a terrible memory, so usually if the option is not on the model, I'll get it wrong. So the next part of this project is to take care of the metallics. As you can see, all the joints, the exhaust, some pieces on the head, everything around the model that is currently either black or has been only hit by the wash of the airbrush needs to be painted metallic. I use Scale 75's Trash Metal. Trash Metal, the name says it all. It's perfect for Death Guard. They're supposed to be about decay. They're supposed to be about trash. So I'm embracing that by using that color. And also, you get 2 metallics in the kit, the metallics kit I got from Scale 75. One of them looks really good for cool, cold, clean metals, and Trash Metal is perfect for those warmer metallics if you want to get a good base. The coverage on the Scale 75 paints is wonderful. By the way, there's like some of the best metallics, But the counterpoint to that is because the metallic glitter, if you will, the metallic flakes that are in the paint are so fine that they tend to destroy the bristles. They get into the scale of any bristles that you use and eventually just absolutely massacre them. So I try to use good but cheap brushes. This is where I use any brush that I got for free during at an event. This is where I'll be using them because they die so quickly, no matter how much effort I put into it. Now once the metallics are done, the base coat, I put a coat of null oil. It not only gets into the recesses, which is great, but it also kind of dulls down the shine. Another thing that's really great about painting Death Guards, even though I'm trying to be as careful as possible, is that they're a forgiving army. If I were painting Eldar, and I remember painting an Eldar army for Adepticon, and everything had to be perfect. I couldn't make any mistakes. I couldn't have any of the washes overflow. None of it was meant to be weathered, so none of them could be allowed to look weathered. Meanwhile, if I'm painting Death Guard, if at some point later in the process I noticed that 2 stages ago I didn't put a wash in the right place, or I hit a piece that should have remained clean, it's not as big a deal because I can sort of repaint over it, add some highlights, add some extra weathering, and just pass it off as intentional. I don't want every mistake to be sort of excused that way, but at the same time it does have that level of forgiveness. Once everything's been washed, I then apply the gold. You can really see the name because it got kind of rubbed off the bottle, but this is Necro Gold from scale 75. Again, same advantages as the silver colors, except this one I'm going to apply to some of the details on the pieces. Some of the fancier models for the Contemptor Dreadnought have a lot more of these kind of gildings everywhere, especially on the shoulders and on the front piece, the torso especially. This one has very little, so there's not too much gold to take care of. I think there's a couple of places here where I hit the wrong spots with the gold, but I let it sort of slide, knowing that I would be going back and putting some weathering. Now, the wash I put for gold is Agrax Earthshade. These are my 2 workhorse as far as washes are concerned. Null Oil and Agrax Earthshade, the liquid talent, if you will. And there's no lying about it. Like, there's no 2 ways about it. These are very good washes because they can be used almost anywhere. On the gold in particular, they're really nice because they keep the warmth of the gold without tarnishing it. And even though I'm using Necro Gold as a base instead of warmer gold, I still want to keep a little bit of the warmth, especially considering how I want those highlights to come out. What's interesting about the fact that there's very little of these golden portions on the model is that each of them will pop out that much more for being that less frequent on the model itself. This is why in the highlight stage you'll see I put a fairly bright highlight on it, knowing that the weathering is going to tone that down, but also because I still want it to pop off. This is Elven Gold from scale 75. It's 1 or 2 steps above. I try to hit only the top of the models so that it can keep some of the shadows from underneath. Use a lot of the side of my brush to make sure I don't get into the recesses and kind of ruin the job I did with the washes. You'll see I don't go underneath the model at all when I do these highlights. First of all, on the tabletop, people won't see them that much, and second of all, you won't, even if they were to be seen, you still want to keep the impression of shadows. Now the same thing I do using heavy metal. I kind of do the obligatory showing of the horns because of the name of the paint, because I'm a nerd. But it's the same process, essentially, just doing the hedge highlighting, picking out the pieces so that when I do apply the weathering, that weathering stage, which you'll see is kind of terrifying. It doesn't dilute, it doesn't tone down the highlighting too much so that it still pops off. I still want those metallics to look good even though they're weathered. In the box, you have the option for a Power Fist and a Power Claw. I don't think it makes a difference stat-wise. I am a sucker for pointy things when it comes to those giant robots. If I have a choice between a fist and a claw on the Dreadnought, I will always take the claw, so that's why I went for. It was tempting for a second to give it some object source lighting to give it that crackly nature, but it's weird, but that feels a little more 40k to me than 30k. 30k is still supposed to be kind of grimdark, and I will have some OSLs on some pieces of this army, but that didn't seem like it was the place. Like I'm gonna have it on weapons. I'm gonna have it on some melta guns. If I do have some of these specific Death Guard specific flamers, I might put some drops of glowing green putrescent liquid falling off of them. That'll be fun. But otherwise, I want to keep it as grimdark as possible. Now I have some orange pieces, which I start with a base of Mournfang. There are very few, a little bit like the gold. There's not many. There's a canister for the flamer in the fist, and the missiles on the missile pod that goes on the back of the Dreadnought, which is one of my favorite pieces as far as an addition to this variation on the Dreadnought. It makes it look a little less like a walking tub, if you will. And I feel that it makes it look a little more like its larger cousins, the Titans, that often have these back-mounted weapons. Now, the reason I use Mournfang is because it's a very saturated brown, and brown, for those who know their color theory, is dark orange. Normally, I prefer doing any highlight, any gradients using the airbrush just because it's so much faster and I'm lazy. But in the case of this, they're such tiny pieces. Obviously, I wasn't going to mask out all the little missiles on the missile pod, and I didn't want to do a sub-assembly for that one either. Also pick out the wires. I usually do those red on other Imperial las cannons that I've painted in the past, just because red tends to pop off so much better than most colors, especially if you have if you're doing Dark Angels or Ultramarines, which have cool colors. Then putting a nice warm red for the wires looks really good. But the logical contrast to the green here is orange, which I'm not going to put too bright, but still, like it's a good reminder of the rust that you see on Death Guards. Meanwhile, also contrasting very beautifully with the green that's all over their armor. There's so many of these tiny missiles. Fortunately, they're not very difficult to pick out. I've seen pieces like that in far more awkward places on models that are hard to go get to. Finally, I put a highlight of Troll Slayer Orange. This is where I do a wet blending gradient so that I can, again, try to get the top of the piece to be more orange. And you can see where that now it goes from a brown piece to an orange piece, which is the color I'm really looking for. Orange is also the color that I will use for the eyes on the Dreadnought, as well as any lens. I don't have a video of the process of doing those tiny details because they're kind of boring to do. And again, much like the airbrush, if I wanted to show those pieces being painted, I'd have to put a different camera setup that I just don't currently have the space for or the equipment for. Otherwise, all you'd see is my big fat fingers like you're seeing right now. On larger pieces, it's okay because I can still twist it in a way that you can see the model. But when doing lenses and eyes on Space Marines, it's going to get a little more difficult. So I didn't want to impose that upon you. I made a mistake doing the last cannon. I had to correct it the same way I did the plate on the front of the Dreadnought, where I airbrushed it from the wrong angle, so I had to sort of do washes to manually have the highlights in the right place so they look from the top of the last cannon instead of the bottom. I also used a little bit of my weathering to help do that. You'll notice I go back twice to some of these pieces because layer paints from Games Workshop are naturally translucent a little bit, which is great because makes them good for blending. But if you really want to have the color pop off, you need to have a second coat. This is the weathering stage. Now, this looks terrible because all the work that I've just gone through is gone, except I've airbrushed a layer of streaking grime from AK Technicals all over every single piece of this model. I am going to be using this white spirit or mineral spirit, depending which part of the world you're at, same thing, and essentially just wiping off everything that I airbrush. So I spend a few dollars on a bottle of streaking grime. I use a good percentage of it to airbrush a model, and then I just wipe it all off. However, what it does is that it leaves recesses, very much like a wash. It leaves recesses filled with the streaking grime, as well as having this kind of uniform patina on top of everything that serves both as a wash and as a glaze. It does the work of a glaze in the sense that you always have this kind of like very, very thin coat that unifies the model, but also gets into the recesses to give it volume and take care of all those dark lining that I was talking about earlier. It's a longer process to wipe the model, and at this point I had glued the arms thinking that I could get a better representation of where the shadows would hit once the weathering was done. But I immediately regretted it because so many of these recesses were very difficult to get to. The full technique on how to use this streaking grime is something I took from Byron at Artist Opus. I'll have a link to the video right here. You can click on that and go check it out yourself. It's a great video. It's a good technique to get things done very quickly. And as you can see, it really changes the model, really gives it some dimension, especially around like rivets and all these details.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider dropping us a like and subscribing. Thanks for watching. Materials shown in this video are provided fully or in part by Games Workshop for promotional purposes.